So I'm pleased here to introduce to you the panelists for this session on state politics. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. I think a lot of the very interesting recent research, and part of it is based on all the data that we've been able to accumulate, which you'll hear about today, has been at the state level, which has proven to be a really good domain to test some of the theories. And so we have three panelists today. First, we have Seth Masket, who is an associate professor at the University of Denver and chair of the Department of Political Science. He's written a book called No Middle Ground, How Informal Party Organizations Control Nominations and Polarized Legislatures. He has written a lot on polarization, on primaries, on state politics, networks, and so we're glad to have him here. Next, we have Boris Shore, who is a professor at the Harris School at the University of Chicago. Boris has written a lot on state-level ideology and polarization. He's basically the guy for state-level data on ideology, and so and I believe he's going to present some new data today, and so we're glad to have him here. He's also an RWJ fellow, a former fellow of RWJ, and then we have Elizabeth Rigby, who's a professor at the George Washington University, also an RWJ fellow.
An assistant professor.
An assistant professor. Well, you know. And she's done a lot of work also at the state level on policy making, income inequality, redistribution. And so without further ado, Seth, you want to start us off?
Okay. Thank you so much for having me here. So the title of my talk is The Cost of Reform. This is aiming to be the concluding chapter of a book I'm working on right now, in which I examine several state-level efforts to either mitigate partisanship or even eliminate parties altogether. And so what I'm trying to do is just sort of, I summarize some of the research I'm doing in this book and then try and get to the conclusion, which is that not only do these efforts almost uniformly fail, but that generally we're worse for the effort. So it's a real cheery topic. My sort of subtitle here is "Stop Trying to Fix Things, You're Only Making Them Worse." In the parlance of this morning, I'm sort of like examining some of the state of some of our T-cell research. And I'm trying to assess, what I'm finding is not only do these therapies not often really work, but they actually may be killing the patient. So think of me as sort of like Matthew McConaughey in Dallas Buyers Club, kind of, or better yet, even don't. Okay, so let me just sort of summarizing what some of the examples I'm looking at here. Colorado's Amendment 27. Okay, this was a campaign finance reform passed by Colorado's voters about 12 years ago. And the idea, and one of the arguments made, was that this would actually help reduce partisanship in the state legislature. What it did is sharply limited the amount of money individuals and parties could donate to state legislative candidates. And the idea being that if you limited how much money these entities could give to candidates, then those candidates will ultimately be less dependent on partisan sources. They would be more independent-minded. I look at Nebraska's history of nonpartisanship. It is, of course, today the only nonpartisan state legislature. You don't see parties on ballots or on any official literature or even on their doors. So we would expect to see relatively unstructured voting there. I also look somewhat at Minnesota's experience with nonpartisanship. For about 60 years, they had a system similar to that of Nebraska's, also a nonpartisan legislature. This was, rather than imposed by voters, nonpartisanship in Minnesota was actually imposed by the state legislature, so legislators ultimately could decide to reimpose partisanship, which they did in 1973. And we can look at some of the changes there. And then another one I want to talk about today is the quote-unquote nonpartisan recall in California a little over a decade ago. This is the election that ousted Governor Gray Davis and brought in Arnold Schwarzenegger. I put nonpartisan in quotes because this wasn't technically a nonpartisan election. Party labels still appeared on that ballot, but there was no primary, there was no caucus, there was no formal system for parties to winnow their number of candidates. And so predictably what you had was a lot of people running for office. You had 134 candidates on that ballot. So all of these are in some ways efforts by either by state constitutional design or by voters or by legislators to somehow limit the role of parties. And what I find is that they all pretty much fail. I'll get into a few of the details of how they failed, but just to go over a little bit of the evidence, and some of this comes from Boris Schor, his work in collecting roll call votes from the last 2 decades of state legislative races, or excuse me, state legislative voting patterns. If you just sort of sort all the states, as Boris does, by how partisan their legislatures are, well, by far number 1 there at the top right is California. Number 2 is actually Colorado. Which was somewhat surprising considering this reform was undertaken a decade ago to mitigate partisanship. If you go back a little ways, Colorado wasn't always number 2. It was actually much further down. Its polarization has actually ramped up somewhat. And also, by the way, spending in its elections has ramped up a lot too since the passage of this reform. It's roughly doubled in state legislative elections. Okay, so that didn't work so good. Going over to Nebraska. It's kind of hard to see this graph, but this shows basically all the state legislatures and their degree of polarization over the last roughly 20 years. And what you would expect to see is Nebraska, basically toward the bottom, having not only either one of the least or the least polarized legislature in the country. And down at the bottom left, you can see that it was, in the 1990s, one of the least polarized legislatures in the country. Something weird has happened in the last decade. It's actually ramped up, as you can see by that highlighted line there on the bottom right. Polarization in Nebraska has not only taken place, but it's accelerated. It's actually the quickest polarizing legislature in the country today. It used to be the most polarized. Now there are, I think, roughly 17 legislatures that are less polarized than Nebraska today. Boris and I are working on a paper on this. Our working theory is that this has something to do with the imposition of term limits in 2006, and parties within the state have responded to this by actually going out and recruiting a much more polarized set of candidates to run for these new open seats. Okay. What else do we have? Minnesota. Okay. So Minnesota had an interesting experience. So for a while, under this nonpartisanship, which it's had since the 1910s, it really was a fairly disorganized state legislature. There were just these kind of ephemeral coalitions that would come and go. By the 1950s and 60s, you had the emergence of these pretty stable governing coalitions, calling themselves the liberal and conservative coalitions, that had built alliances outside the legislature with labor and business groups that were actually running the chamber. They were running committees. They were actually going out and recruiting people to run with them in elections. This is a nominate plot based on ideal points from 1969, toward the end of this nonpartisan era. And basically all the L's on the left are the people calling themselves liberals, and the C's on the right are those calling themselves conservative. It's a fairly divided chamber. And yet voters never saw these labels. These didn't appear on any ballots. So when legislators reestablished partisanship in 1973, they did it mostly to get rid of the fiction of nonpartisanship. It was just seen as almost silly at that point. Finally, jumping over to California, yes, you had 134 candidates in that race. Nonetheless, the results of that election looked surprisingly kind of normal. You had 3 candidates getting 94% of the total vote. It was Schwarzenegger, who nearly got a majority, getting 49% of the vote. Followed by the Democrat Cruz Bustamante, and then a more conservative Republican Tom McClintock. The remaining 131 candidates got only 6% of the vote there. So what was going on there? Partially, this is just like some hot Duverger action. That's a thing, yeah. Voters just not wanting to waste their votes. But partially, this is also the parties acting in an unofficial way to really winnow the vote, winnow the number of candidates there. I have lots of evidence of party leaders on both sides using endorsements, using funding, and sometimes outright bullying to get some very high-quality candidates out of the race and convince them to drop and to really converge support around Schwarzenegger and Bustamante. Okay, so why did these things fail? Well, the argument I make is that this has a lot to do with what Tom Mann was talking about earlier, the kind of network nature of parties. That is, a lot of these reforms have approached parties as though they were these hierarchical monoliths that could be regulated away. And we're coming to understand parties more as these coalitions of interest groups and activists, office holders, candidates, donors, even some journalists, that work together in a somewhat less formal way to essentially pick candidates they like and give them advantages and hurt other candidates who they don't like very much and try and get people elected and move government in one direction or another. This network aspect actually gives them a lot of strength. That is, networks can be very adaptive to reforms and to new laws. If a law weakens one area of a network, another area of the network can take over for it. And we see some of this reactions to campaign finance reform, to primary rules, and other things give evidence that the broader parties can actually still be very active even when parties themselves are under a great deal of duress, at least legally. Now, we might say to ourselves at this point, well, okay, so these reforms kind of failed. Okay, so what? At least we can also recognize that maybe partisanship really is a problem, okay? That it is serious, that it's causing a great deal of anxiety, sometimes causing a great deal of gridlock, and at least these reformers are trying to do something about it, and maybe they haven't quite found that precise way to do it yet, but each time they try we get a little evidence and we get a little closer to actually reining in partisanship. But it actually gets worse than that. The problem is that sometimes these attempts are actually causing externalities, they're causing costs, imposing costs on voters and on political observers. One example I'll give from this is campaign finance reform. So the example I had before in Colorado, so the story of what happened in Colorado, as I mentioned, there was this fairly stringent campaign finance restrictions put in place in 2002. What happened? Well, a lot of the innovation came right after that on the left. And what you saw was a small group of very wealthy, very liberal donors who coordinated with the Democratic Party in the state to try and take over the State House. And what they did was the state party said, well, these are the races we think we need to flip in order to take over the State House. And they managed to channel millions of dollars through a very complex network of 527s and independent expenditure committees and other groups in order to get the money where they wanted it to go. It was no longer a simple matter of one donor giving to one candidate. It was now a lot more complex. But they were spending millions of dollars in races where previously only thousands had been spent before, and it totally overwhelmed the Republicans, and it actually worked. They flipped the state House from Republican to Democratic in 2004, the same year that Bush won the presidential race within the state, which is a fairly impressive achievement. The downside is that money is almost impossible to follow now. It is simply going through too many different sources to make it remotely achievable to figure out who is backing a given candidate for the state legislature. A Denver Post reporter named Karen Crummy tried to actually chart this path of Democratic money in 2010 and came up with this lovely graph. She estimates it took her about 100 hours to just figure out the financial transactions. And we have here pictures of the big blue dots are some of the major Democratic 527s, and you can see some of the sources of their money and where they were spending it. But suffice it to say, it's if you want to actually figure out who's backing someone today, it's virtually impossible. Okay. Now, this, of course, has gone on at the federal level as well. If you look at that blue squiggly line there in the middle of this graph is a total amount of federal spending on federal campaigns, total amount of spending on federal campaigns, it's congressional and presidential. And, of course, that goes up and down since 1998, depending on whether there's a presidential race in play. But it's a pretty steady upward rise, roughly 30% per year, so much, much greater than inflation. Those red bars show the percentage of funding on federal campaigns that is outside or dark money, meaning that it's going through 527s or super PACs or some of these other funding entities that only have limited disclosure requirements. And you can see a sharp jump there right before 2004. That's the passage of McCain-Feingold, BICRA. Another sharp jump there around 2012 in response to Citizens United. Basically, we're at the point today where roughly $1 in $5 spent on a federal campaign is almost impossible to trace. Okay, so So there's one of your downsides. Jumping over to another aspect of it getting worse is nonpartisan elections. So right around the time that Minnesota switched over from nonpartisan to partisan elections in the 1970s, there were a few studies done of voting behavior in the state. And what people found was that under the nonpartisan system, there was greater voter confusion. There was lower turnout. That is, there was greater roll-off between upper ticket and down ballot races. And there was a greater incumbency advantage. Okay, voters needed some sort of a cue. When there were parties, they could rely on that. When there weren't parties, they would just simply vote for the incumbent. Some other research I did on California during its cross-filing era in the early 20th century, when parties were very weak in the legislature there. You found, well, less organized legislative voting, greater power for lobbyists, and greater corruption. There were simply more cases where lobbyists were simply offering money in exchange for roll call votes. So where I kind of end up with this chapter is just the question, why are we trying to undermine these parties in the first place? Yes, they're incredibly unpopular and frustrating and sometimes even potentially a little dangerous. But they also remain the best tool we've developed for improving voters' knowledge, for promoting turnout, for organizing elections and giving them some meaning, for organizing legislatures and so forth. And so I think the burden should be on reformers to say, well, what's wrong with that in the first place? Anyway, thank you.